Dr. Maria Parani received her doctorate from the University of Oxford in Byzantine art and archaeology and has held a number of fellowships all over the world pretty much, such as Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., the University of Crete, Princeton University, and at the University of Cyprus now, where she has been teaching Byzantine and post-Byzantine art and archaeology since 2005. Much of her work concerns Byzantine clothing and the art and archaeology of medieval Cyprus. And today she's going to step a little bit outside of her field of work and talk about material culture in possibly Byzantine and definitely Frankish Cyprus, and just talk to us about what material culture and daily life in Cyprus was. This is admittedly something I know very little about, and so I'm very happy that Maria has accepted my invitation. So Dr. Maria Parani, welcome to the History of Cyprus podcast.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today and share what some of my thoughts with you about material culture in Frankish Cyprus.
When we talk about material culture, what are we referring to exactly? Can you give us an understanding of what material culture refers to specifically?
Well, material culture in the broadest sense is everything tangible created by humans, by human hands. It can be structures like houses or churches, and it can be portable objects like religious images, books, tools, textiles, furnishings, anything created by human hands. More specifically, when one talks about the material culture of daily life, it concerns tangible aspects of related to everyday living, what humans use in their daily lives. So that's material culture for you.
When we talk about material culture, what sort of information do those tangible objects convey to us today?
It conveys information both about the artifacts, the materials themselves, about the technology, materials used, but also we use the tangible to study the intangible, to study customs, beliefs, practices, to study social structure, to study economy. So it opens up the study of material culture windows into the lives and the outlook, the worldviews of people in the past, and also about connections with other people, with other cultures. So it's really an exciting avenue it provides an exciting avenue of studying the past human societies.
Okay, and if we wanted to contextualize the period now, what's the fabric of Cypriot community in the 13th and 14th centuries? And I'm going to add one more thing to this, Maria.
Yeah.
How does that contrast or compare to the fabric of Cypriot society in the Byzantine period? I mean, I know that's really your expertise, but maybe we can chat about both sides and how they are similar or different.
In Byzantine times, down to the late 12th century in Cyprus was part of the Byzantine world, the Byzantine Empire. And at the time, both the ruling class, but also the people, the majority of the people were Byzantine Greeks, and they were Greek Orthodox as far as their religion was concerned. There were other minorities on the island, but the dominant, for example, you had Armenians, possibly Maronites, there were some Venetians, but the majority of the population was the Byzantine Greeks, who, as I mentioned, were Greek Orthodox. When we have the establishment of the Latin Kingdom in Cyprus in the late 12th century, what happens is that the ruling class changes. It becomes Frankish. We have French crusaders coming over from the Latin East, and they take over the island. So we have a new ruling class who are the Franks, and who also are Latin, what we say today Catholic in terms of their creed. So they become the ruling class of Cyprus at the time, and the Greek population, which remains the majority in terms of numbers, they become subjects to this ruling Frankish ruling class. And then we also have other, as I said, minorities. We still have the Armenians, we have Maronites, we have Jews, we have Italians, and especially from the 13th century onwards, we have also many Syrians who come from the Middle East and settle on the island. So it's a mix in terms of the ethnic groups that we have on Cyprus in the 13th and the 14th century. But the two dominant groups are the ruling Franks and the Greeks.
Given the multicultural character of Cyprus in this period, are we able to associate certain goods with specific groups? Like, you can find something and say this is clearly Latin and this is clearly Greek.
Well, it depends where you find it, and it depends if it has an inscription identifying the object as belonging to someone specifically, and giving, for example, when you find tombstones with portraits of deceased individuals and inscriptions there, you know that this belongs to this group or is representative of another group. But often, and especially if you don't have a context, if you don't know where the object comes from, and if you don't know along with what other objects it was found, it's very difficult to assign it to a specific cultural or ethnic group, because objects travel. And it was quite, it was quite natural at that time for an individual, for example, a Frankish lord, to own objects of, Italian origin or Islamic origin or Byzantine origin. So unless you have the context, it's very difficult to assign ownership of an object.
Now, typically, and I'm going to generalize here, when you go to a museum, the vast majority of the material goods that you see there, and again, this is a generalization, you assume are from tombs and temples and churches, perhaps. In the case of the medieval period and Byzantine period, where do archaeologists and historians, where do they come across these possessions in this material culture? Is it similar? Is it just curious as to where you typically come across these things?
You can, first of all, you find them through excavations. You have excavations, and during the excavation, you find these material remains that you can study. When it comes to the archaeological excavations of the period that we are discussing, these are mostly what we call salvage excavations. They are excavations undertaken in areas that are going to be developed, for building a new structure and all that. So the archaeology needs to be explored, and before the new building or road or whatever is constructed. And there, interesting finds come to light, but it's the archaeologist really has no. This is not a targeted scientific excavation with specific research questions. It's just you do it to salvage what is there. And so, I mean, for example, we often have them in cities, salvage excavations, and that's where you can find sometimes open small windows into urban neighborhoods, and interesting finds come to light. Targeted excavations where the archaeologist chooses the site because he or she wants to explore a specific area in order to discover how people lived in that particular area, are much more rare when it comes to the study of the 13th and the 14th century in Cyprus. For example, as far as I know, we don't have a single excavation of a medieval village in Cyprus. So while we might know how people lived in the cities, we really don't know how they lived in the villages. So the information we have, at least from archaeology, is very fragmented. What archaeologists do in the countryside is they have large surface surveys. So from surface finds, you can tell whether an area is busy, inhabited, in use, or not, and you can also tell about the kind of use, land use, that is taking place there, but not much more than that. And then there are also excavations, explorations around churches, which is more common in Cypriot archaeology, and you also find cemeteries around churches. Some of the material that we have also comes from excavation of burials. And from that, you have elements of dress or maybe some vessels that have been placed in the burials. And recently, we also have studies of the bones in the burials. So from this studies, people, archaeologists can learn about health, the health of the population, problems with diseases, but also about their diets. So it's really a new, exciting avenue of research.
You know, one of the things I'm actually writing stuff down as you're talking, because one of the things you mentioned, now that you mentioned the burials, and I was wondering if there was material goods deposited in Byzantine and later Frankish graves, because when I think of that, when I think of depositing goods, I always associate that with the archaic period, the Hellenistic period, what have you. Does this tradition continue in earnest later for the Byzantines and of course for the Frankish period as well? And if so, what sort of goods do we usually see deposited in these graves?
Well, for Byzantium, and especially after the establishment of Christianity, I'm talking about the Byzantine Empire now. No goods are deposited in burials because the beliefs about the need of the dead in the tomb change with Christianity. The dead don't need anything in the tombs. So you have no objects ritually deposited to accompany the dead in the tombs. What you might have, and you might find in burials, is in Byzantine burials, are elements of dress that were, part of the attire of the deceased when deposited. You might find especially metal accessories from from his or her dress. And you also might find some objects that were part of the burial ritual. For example, a lamp, an oil lamp that stayed there, that was, was used for the ritual and then was left behind. More rarely, for example, you might find in a child's burial, you might find a doll, which was placed there, one assumes, by the grieving parents. But that's more kind of a sentimental gesture rather than anything ritual. When we come into the Frankish period, there is this custom to deposit a ceramic bowl, one of those nice, lovely sgraffito bowls that become common after the 13th century and are also produced on Cyprus. We start finding the bowls, a single bowl usually, ceramic bowl, placed in burials. But I don't really know, we are not sure whether it was placed there as part of some ritual where it had a symbolic meaning, or whether it had been used for the burial ritual and it was deposited later in the tomb. But we find these ceramic bowls later, a single bowl in some of the burials, but I really am not sure why it was placed there and what its purpose was.
The bowls, and I can picture exactly what you're talking about. They have this greenish and / yellowish hue. There's depictions of people on them often. These bowls were they associated with I know you said it was the Frankish period, but were they typically found in Frankish tombs, if you're able to determine?
No, because we find them in burials around Greek Orthodox churches. So we assume that the people buried there are Greek. So no, there is no association with Frankish, as far as I can tell. No, we find them in burials associated with Greek Orthodox churches that we find this bowl, as they are called, bowl burials.
Now, in one of your papers, you mention that there's a scarcity, and actually you just mentioned it now, there's a scarcity of targeted archaeological investigations. So what accounts for the dearth of evidence in general?
Partly, to excavate is a very expensive in terms of resources, but also time. So you need to locate, first of all, the archaeologist needs to have an interest in this period, and also find an appropriate site to carry out the excavation. In terms of excavations, targeted excavations for this period, we had recently an excavation at Pyrgos Tillirias undertaken by Stylianos Perdikis, but there what came to light was a manor rather than a village, a medieval village. So we have possibly the manor of a feudal lord, of the area. But we really don't have excavations of settlements. The resources have been allocated mostly to the excavation and conservation of ecclesiastical monuments so far, and it just it hasn't materialized yet. It really hasn't materialized. We know more, as I mentioned, of what happens in the cities, because of this, of the salvage excavations, because cities, they need to develop, and this gives the opportunity to do these excavations where you have the development sites. But outside the cities, as I said, it's very difficult, and most of the archaeological missions working on Cyprus are interested in earlier periods rather than the medieval period. Even though there are exceptions, for example, there was work at Podamia, which was, but there it was again a field survey rather than an excavation. But also there are some excavations of, when it comes to the the medieval period, some industrial sites were excavated. For example, sugar mills. Cyprus was known for its production of sugar. So sugar mills at Kouplia, Episkopi, and Kolossi have been excavated. So what we haven't excavated are settlements, medieval settlements. We still don't have that, which explains why we don't know much about the material culture of the lower classes, because they are also not very well represented in the written sources. So they are, I wouldn't say invisible, but very hard to see in the report.
Yeah, you mentioned like ironically, I found it very ironic that most of our understanding of the material culture comes from the written sources. Maybe not most, but a lot of it does. And including you mentioned a Wilbrand, Count of Oldenburg, who visited Cyprus in 1211, and he speaks of an affluence in the period. So what does he and others like him typically observe about this sort of standard of living in Cyprus?
Well, they, coming from the West, they observe things that to them they seem exotic, different. Many of them observe the affluence of the island, especially when they come in the 13th and the 14th century. They notice and they visit the major cities, the capital, Nicosia, and from the late 13th century, Famagusta, which was the major port of the city. So they are very impressed by the wealth of the people, and so they talk about this, but they also talk about, and they also, a number of them also talk about the wines, that they are very good wines on Cyprus, but they also talk about habits, practices that are unusual for them. For example, they describe the houses and the decoration of the houses. They describe the baths, because again, this is not something that they were used to, and the rich furnishing of the baths. They also describe certain habits that, as I said, they surprise them, because they expect to visit, a Latin kingdom, but then they see practices that are strange to them. For example, one visitor, one traveler comments on the fact that people eat sitting on the ground because it's cooler, he says. They prefer to sit on the ground to eat because it's cooler. And for him, this is startling, because he's used to eating sitting at a table, not on the ground. So he comments on this. So it's whatever seems exotic and strange and different to them. And as I said, also the opulence, the impressive fabrics, because Cyprus at the time was also famous for its production of specific luxury fabrics and gold thread and embroidery. So they pick that up and they comment on it. So these are the things that they single out for and they write in their accounts.
You mentioned how they noticed the homes looked different. How would they have compared?
They look different in a way. One of them comments that in the early 13th century, the houses were, at least in Nicosia, decorated with paintings like the houses in Antioch, for example. Yes, but unfortunately, he doesn't tell us what this decoration is. So this comparison with Antioch is interesting. But for example, I don't know how many Western houses would have had a private bath, for example. And when we are talking about baths, we are talking about something, a structure that is very similar to what listeners might know as a Turkish bath today. So we are talking about this kind. We are not talking about a room with a bathtub. We are talking about a building with, a heated room where you could, the water is heated and you could sit and, imagine it like similar to a Turkish bath. So with rose water and perfumes and, curtains and couches where you could sit and relax. So I doubt very much that they had this in Western homes. The Franks came into contact with this first in the Holy Land, and they were familiar with this, and then they adopted this practice, and then they continued when they moved to Cyprus. And so as I said, I don't know how Western homes were, and I mean Western Europe is such a big area. So, but in Cyprus, usually for the big homes, the houses of the nobility, you had the spaces arranged around a courtyard. Usually there was a courtyard, probably with a well. And then on the ground floor, you would have the functional spaces, storerooms, stables, kitchen. And then on the upper floor, that's where you would have the space where the family or the owner would live. Where differences are more obvious are, of course, in ecclesiastical architecture, in the ecclesiastical sphere, not in the daily in daily life. I think the Franks adjusted to the realities that they found.
There was a Latin bishop that I was really interested in reading about, Guy de Ibelin, who was a Dominican, which Dominicans, for those listening, they're known for their austerity. But his material possessions that we have records of, they don't vibe with how austere a Dominican's supposed to be, but it's also very revealing as to being a man of letters and a monk and a feudal lord, I suppose. He had a lot of material possessions. So what else? What do we know about, for example, pastimes? That I found that really interesting.
Bishops, Latin bishops, were also nobles. So, I mean, he was austere, Guy de Ibelin was austere in the sense that He didn't have many garments or jewelry, or even his household utensils. I mean, he didn't have a lot of silver tableware for display, for example. When you compare it with the material possessions of another bishop from Cyprus, a Latin bishop of Paphos. So you can say that he's more, in a sense, it's more severe. He had lots of books. He had, we know this because once he passed away, his possessions were recorded. That's why we have a detailed record of his possessions. So we know that he had 50 books, and at the time 50 books are a lot of books. Books were not cheap, so for someone to own a library of 50 books is very impressive. So this shows his intellectual pursuits. But on the other hand, as I said, he was also a noble. And as a noble, for example, he enjoyed hunting. He had a falcon. They used to hunt with falcons at the time, as well as dogs and also leopards. But he didn't have a leopard, he had a falcon. And he also had a tent, probably for hunting in the countryside. You didn't, you could spend days hunting, so you needed your tent to spend time in the countryside hunting. And he also apparently enjoyed chess. He played chess and backgammon. So being a bishop and being a Dominican didn't mean that he wouldn't enjoy other activities that were, let's say, characteristic of his rank as also a noble. So yes, and he also had weapons. I mean, and he participated in a military campaign against Alexandria, actually.
Yeah, that's one of I always found that interesting, that when you compare the Greek Rite, Orthodox tradition to Catholic Western Rite in the medieval period, that bishops could be knights and take up the sword, and that's very different.
This yes, it's completely alien to the Byzantine and the Orthodox mentality. And it was one of the shocking when the Byzantines first came into contact with Crusaders. This was one of the aspects that really shocked them, that monks and clergymen would carry weapons and fight. This was a major shock for them.
We mentioned, or we talked about briefly, about the like the bowls, the glazed wares. What sort of iconography was typically found on these vessels? And do we know, and whatever that might have been, what does it say about the period? What did people in either Byzantine or later on in the Frankish period value or celebrate? What does it tell us about their worldview?
We have this production. It picks up in the 13th century and continues. And we have, there is a great variety on the vessels. You can have birds and animals and fish. You can have human figures, men and women. When you have men, you can find representations of warriors, of hunters, for example. Women, you can find women. Some of them might be dancing. Others hold a beaker and a napkin as if they are serving a drink. You have images of couples. You can also have heraldic motifs like the lion rampant of the Lusignan and other heraldic motifs, geometric motifs. So it seems, especially the ones with the human figures, this iconography has been interpreted as reflecting kind of a love of life and the pleasures of life. As I said, the hunt, the dance, couples. Some scholars have argued that this iconography has been inspired by chivalric values and chivalric romances, Western romances. But these values and this enjoyment of the pleasures of life is not characteristic only of Western society, but also in Byzantium, but also in Cyprus as well. We know that everyone enjoyed these kinds of activities. And so it seems here that this iconography could appeal not just to the Franks, but to everyone living on the island. It was a kind of where we can see it as a point where the tastes of different groups converge in a way, which makes it really, really fascinating.
Much like today, and I'm sure we can all relate to this, material goods, they're not always strictly utilitarian. We've danced around this a little bit here, and there seems to have been a lot of evidence for strictly conspicuous consumption, wealth, for the sake of wealth. What sort of finds or records do we have of some of the more affluent material that would have been owned in Cyprus in that period?
We have, again, it's mostly from written sources that we know about this, even though occasionally we do find in the archaeological record, we do find some items that are imported. But for the most luxurious items, we need to go to, we rely on sources. For example, we know at the royal palace of the Lusignan, you could find there was a huge musical organ, for example, or a clock that was in the 14th century, a clock that was manufactured in Venice. On the other hand, we also have, and these are extant objects, we have evidence that they used, or at least they ordered, they had products of Mamluk metalwork. So they were quite eclectic in their tastes. But even not just in the royal palace, even the Dominican bishop we talked about, he had possessions both from the East, the Islamic world, and also from the West, from Spain, if I remember correctly. So yes, they could afford, and in Cyprus being where it was, they had access to products, luxury products from all over the Mediterranean world. And they made use of them to showcase both their resources, their power, their wealth, but also their connections and their ambitions, I would say.
We've talked about how there's a scarcity of finds for the lower classes for a variety of reasons, like we talked about. what do we know would have been typical regardless for lower classes, even though they might not have been written about, or we might not have as much material culture that has survived? What are some typical things that we could expect the lower classes, the peasants, if you will, to have possessed?
Peasants are not a single category. You can have, even among peasants, you have those who are better off and those who are really poor. So, and we have some written evidence of peasants actually donating, making donations to churches. So some of them had some means. But when it comes to actual material remains, what we have often, and this is what comes from, especially from the finds of surveys, archaeological surveys, are fragments of ceramic vessels, and especially and also cooking pots. So in a house, you would expect to have a cooking pot, at least one, some vessels for storage. Of course, they would have needed storage, pithoi or other ceramic vessels for storage. We know from written sources that in houses they would also have icons. Let's not forget the icons at the house. In the house, where they would light a lamp before the icon or burn some incense before the icon. We can't really have a picture of how the interiors of those houses were and where exactly they slept and how. But as I said, there is room for future research in this area. Yeah. But we do know, as I said, about their use of ceramic vessels and especially ceramic cooking pots.
Maria, this is going into this not really knowing much about the material culture and the things that you could find and expect to and to interpret. This is great. I'm really appreciative of your time. Thank you so much for coming on to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.